Well, the LSU Tigers landed another transfer portal player, and I know it wasn't a sexy move, but not all necessary moves are sexy necessarily.
You are Locked On LSU, your daily podcast on the LSU Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is up, y'all? Welcome into Locked On LSU. Thank you for making us your first listen every single day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. We're on your preferred podcast platform, whether it's Apple Music and Spotify and Amazon, and we're also on YouTube. So if you're somebody that likes to watch podcasts in addition to listening to them, you can check us out on YouTube. Just hit that subscribe button and like and comment, rate, review, and subscribe, all of that great stuff. Of course, always appreciate you for making us your first listen every single day. And of course, also appreciate you for interacting with the podcast. Let's get into it. I hope that everybody had a very fun and safe Memorial Day weekend, taking the weekend to remember why we had Monday off, and of course, honoring those who paid the ultimate sacrifice for our country. I had a great vacation. Happy to be back. A lot to get into on the podcast, not just today, but throughout the week. So be prepared for me to spam you with some Locked On LSU content here over the next couple of days. But first, I wanted to touch on a transfer portal move that the LSU Tigers made, football side of things, that is. A move that was made just a couple of days ago. You might be listening to this, and if you haven't been dialed in, if you've been living in a baseball space, if you've been coming off of your Memorial Day weekend hangover, you may be like, wait, what are you talking about? A transfer portal move? Like, I didn't hear of any offensive linemen or wide receivers or corners that committed to LSU recently, and you'd be correct, because it was a move that LSU made that probably went under the radar because it's not very sexy. It's not a position that we talk about very much on this podcast. At least, ideally, you don't want to talk about this position very much, because if you're not talking about this position, that means your position, or at least that position, is in pretty good shape. But it's important to talk about it today because I think that just this move alone speaks volumes. We know that actions speak louder than words, and it was a move that was made, announced at least over the past couple of days, that LSU has added a transfer portal punter to the roster in Blake Oxendorf out of Louisiana Tech. Now, it's an underrated position of need. Look, I do this podcast every day. I talk about what LSU needs. We talk about corners. We talk about defensive tackles. We talked a lot about backup quarterback. And even then, I said, I know that backup quarterback isn't the sexiest position out there to talk about, but what happens, knock on all the wood and crossing of all the fingers, what happens if Garrett Nussmeier gets hurt? Well, I mean, do you necessarily trust Ricky Collins to take over the reins, even though he's only taken, a grand total of 4 snaps in college football? I wouldn't. So they're positions of need. It's not all aspects of roster construction and roster building and transfer portal is super sexy. So LSU brings in Blake Oxendorf through the transfer portal, again, the punter from Louisiana Tech. And frankly, it's not a position we've talked about because it's not a position that we've needed to talk about. It's not been a position of need for the LSU Tigers because Jay Bramblett has just kind of been that go-to reliable guy. And frankly, we didn't even have to worry about him much last year because he didn't really do much of anything last year because he didn't have to. So let's just take a look at, just to add context to where this position group has been at over the last couple of years. In 2022, Jay Bramblett averaged 44 and a half yards per punt, 26th best in college football, the 4th best in the SEC. Again, I'm not going to act like I'm any sort of expert in the punting profession, but the numbers speak for itself. In 2023, Jay Bramblett doesn't even show up on the list of punters across college football. I checked, trust me. I was doing my research. I checked the list on ESPN. Control F LSU, Control F Bramblett, Control F J. Nothing popped up. I thought that's weird. Okay. Let me go to a different website and then a different website and a different website. And I go to websites where I go to check statistics and do a little bit of research. Jay Bramblett doesn't show up on any of them for the 2023 season. And it's because he only punted 26 times. To put that into perspective, let's just take a look around the rest of the SEC. Wilson Berry, the punter at Kentucky, punted 56 times last year. Alabama, James Burnham, the punter for the Crimson Tide last year, 59 punts. 61 for Oscar Chapman at Auburn. 41 for Nick, I'm not even going to try to attempt the last name, Texas A&M. 42 at Florida, 49 at Mississippi State, 59 at Arkansas, 57 at Vanderbilt. You get my point, right? Whopping 62 at South Carolina. My goodness, a whole lot of punting going on in Columbia. But you get my point, right? That the average punter, at least in this conference, is attempting about double the number of punts Jay Bramblett did this past season. We all know how great the offense was. But when we talk about that offense, at least I don't. Maybe you do. Maybe you're a special teams enthusiast. And if you are, then hats off to you. But I don't talk about, well, what are the effects of the punter? I don't. Until now, to be honest with you. So the last couple of years, Jay Bramblett has been that kind of reliable guy that you haven't really thought about or worried about. And last year, you didn't have to think or worry about him because this team never punted. What was it, the Georgia State game or the Florida game? Perhaps the Georgia State game. That sounds more right. I don't think Jay Bramblett even touched a football that day. So you haven't had to worry about it. Jay Bramblett exercises his NCAA eligibility. Now you're getting into Peyton Todd territory. And this is now where we're breaking down LSU's current situation, what Blake Oxendorf is walking into. Peyton Todd in the 2021 recruiting class was the number one player in the country at that position. So it signed with LSU in 2020, at the end of 2020. So you might be thinking to yourself, okay, it's just a, easy passing of the torch. I don't expect anybody to be experts of that position at LSU. Frankly, I don't. But what spoke volumes to me is what Brian Kelly said about Peyton Todd after the spring game. He said, it's not as consistent as I would like. I thought today was an opportunity for him to just say, hey, there's no competition here, and he's got to be more consistent, quite frankly. He's long, he's got all the tools. He's a classic case of today. You've got 14 practices. You look great, and today the ball was wobbling. It was not what I was looking for, nor was it what he was looking for either. He's a great kid. But look, this is about performance on Saturdays, and he has got to do a better job. I always appreciate when Brian Kelly doesn't mince words. Whenever Brian Kelly doesn't give you so much information that it's like, whoa, maybe want to get the lock and key out from Mr. Blabbermouth over here, but he'll shoot you straight. Like, he will be upfront and honest with you. And that right there was an upfront and honest evaluation of Brian Kelly's punter that, hey, he wasn't good enough today. And we can't risk taking that into game one against USC. And once you get into SEC play, we can't risk having the ball wobbling and not being as sharp and as consistent as the coaching staff and the punter himself would have liked. So in comes Blake Oxendorf. Blake Oxendorf started his college career at a small school in Minnesota, transferred to Louisiana Tech, and got the job in 2023. So last season, 53 punt attempts, averaged 45.7 yards per punt. That's the 15th best in college football. Led Conference USA, but 15th best in college football. Now, I know that there is more context to those numbers than I can provide because, again, I'm not an expert at Louisiana Tech football. I didn't watch any games. I didn't. I'll be honest. But I think just the numbers for what they are compared to the rest of college football, you can like what you see. What adding Blake Oxendorf does, it adds options and it adds competition throughout the offseason. I always say I'm pro positional competition. It's more so when we're talking about left tackle or quarterback or maybe a little bit more high profile positions. But don't get it twisted. Punter is a lot more important than I think you and I talk about on a day-to-day basis. It's not sexy. I get it. And that's what I want to get into coming up next is do not get me started with special teams and do not roll your eyes as I'm talking about these things. And I will explain why coming up after just a couple of words from our sponsors. Okay, I want to tell you about FanDuel. It is winner take all time in the NBA and NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a win of your own. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and so much more. And if you're looking for something to place some money on, tonight it's the Dallas Stars at the Edmonton Oilers. It's game 4. Dallas now leads the series 2-1. I'm putting my money on the Oilers. I think that this is going to be a very back and forth series. I think these two teams are very evenly matched. On one side in Edmonton, you've got two of the biggest superstars in the game in Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl. But this Dallas team, they are so stacked from top to bottom. They've got playmakers, everywhere around on that roster. So I think that this is going to be a good back and forth series. I don't see this being a gentleman's sweep situation for Dallas. So I'm going to take Edmonton to win game 4. But hey, that's my take. You can do it however you want to do it, but just do it with FanDuel. Visit fanduel.com/locked on and make every playoff shot count. Again, that is fanduel.com/locked on. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. All right, rolling along here, locked on LSU. Thanks for making us your first listen every single day. We're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Do you have to turn down the volume with all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all of the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every single day. Okay, so LSU brings in Blake Oxendorf, a punter from Louisiana Tech in the transfer portal, the latest transfer portal acquisition. So now you've got a punter room of Peyton Todd and Blake Oxendorf. I know there are so many of you listening to this and saying, why the hell do I care? Like, why the hell am I supposed to care about punter? It's punter. I don't care about a punter. And I get it. I understand. I understand that thought, or at least I understood that thought, and I maybe even agreed with that sentiment. But allow me to remind everyone of the 2022 season. Remember Florida State? Yeah, you muffed 2 punts, missed an extra point and a field goal. So that was at least 4 points on the board. Remember, you lost that game by 1. I understand none of that has anything to do with the punter. That was a Malik Nabers muffed punt, and that was a kicking issue and a blocking issue, and that's the reason why you missed out on those extra points. I get that. Need I remind you of the Tennessee game when Jack Besh muffed the opening kickoff? You gave Tennessee, which in the 2022 season had the best offense in college football, you gave them field position at like your own 10. And obviously they scored. So you were basically getting off to a start against Tennessee at 11 a.m., which was horrendous, the #1 offense in the country, and you're basically handing them 7 points on a silver platter because your special teams couldn't get their bleep together. I can go on and on and on about the physical, emotional, mental trauma, and I'm being dramatic, that 2022 special teams unit put me and this entire fan base through. And my point was always, look, special teams just needs to be something that you don't worry about. Making a 35-yard field goal shouldn't be something that you worry about, at least in nice conditions. Fielding a punt shouldn't be something that you worry about. Handing your opponent solid field position shouldn't be something that we as fans have to worry about. Special teams are what I like to call the gimmies, right? They're the little things that make big differences. That if you just look at a final score or a box score, you might be able to get a good idea of what went down in a game without actually watching it. But special teams they're the tiny little details that you don't get in a box score or in the spark notes of a game. That, okay, yeah, you might see that Tennessee scored on their first possession, but what you don't see is that LSU handed them ideal field position, gimme field position. That's a special teams flub. And then that's where you got out to a 7-0 start. That was a much different game than just one touchdown. I understand that. But that's at the very beginning of the game. Let's not act like momentum is not a factor here. Let's not act like morale on the sidelines isn't a factor here. Let's not act like special teams can either be the greatest momentum creator or the greatest momentum killer throughout the course of a game. And I know that special teams encompasses so much more than just the punter. I understand that. I understand that the issues that LSU was facing in 2022 had much more to do with Jay Bramblett than it did, anything. So much more to do than just Jay Bramblett. I'll clarify there. I get that. But punter is a part of it. If you can pin your opponent back to their 15, well, I'll take those odds. Especially with a defense that I have a lot of questions with. If you're consistently handing your opponent field position between the 40s, I don't like that. I don't like this defense getting a stop there. I don't like the idea of making your opponent's job any easier than it needs to be. Insert the punter. So I get it. It's not the sexiest thing to talk about. I get it. That there are, once we get into closer into the season and SEC Media Days time and the official countdown for game 1 can really start because we're about 100 days out now. I get it. We're going to be talking about much juicier things, much sexier things than the punter. I get it. I know. I understand it. I hear you. I was once in your camp. But all it takes is getting burned by special teams here and there, and it ultimately being the reason that you lose a game instead of win a game. That you did everything right on offense and on defense, but it was just a couple of mistakes on special teams that cost you a game. That I cannot live with. I cannot live with that, especially with this schedule that LSU has coming up, especially in an SEC that's only getting more competitive and more difficult with Texas and Oklahoma joining the fold, with Ole Miss constructing a super team. Let's not forget Alabama is still a good team now. Let's not forget Texas is perceived as one of the best teams in the country. And oh yeah, by the way, you still have the Georgia Bulldogs that had the team and the roster and the talent to win its 3rd national championship in as many years. This game, it's funky, right? We know it's won and lost in the trenches. I understand that. I fully subscribe to that belief. But it's a game of inches. It's a game of death by 1,000 cuts, or at least it can be. I'm not willing to take that kind of gamble with a punter that Brian Kelly was very honest about. It did not mince words about not being good enough. So I get it. I know. I understand. Bigger fish to fry, more interesting storylines, and we will continue to get into those throughout the rest of the week. Trust me, I got you. But just a reminder that even the not sexy things can be sexy and important at some point. Coming up next, I want to do a little bit of a roundup of where LSU now stands in the transfer portal, this entire transfer portal cycle, not just spring, not just fall, but where LSU kind of stands right now in the transfer portal. And we'll get into that coming up next. All right, rolling along here on Locked On LSU. Let's take a look at LSU's transfer portal after the most recent addition of Blake Oxendorf, the punter out of Louisiana Tech. Let's start from the top. This is fall, this is spring. The entire class of 9 transfer portal players that LSU has collected in this last cycle. Jayden Gilbert, 4-star safety out of Texas A&M. I think that we can all assume to see a decent bit of Jayden Gilbert this upcoming season. Xavier Thomas, the wide receiver out of Mississippi State, and of course, Louisiana native as well. I expect to see a decent bit of Xavier Thomas in addition to Jayden Gilbert. AJ Swan, transfer from Vanderbilt, a 3-star transfer. Backup quarterback this upcoming season and is most likely in backup quarterback battle with Ricky Collins. Austin Osbury, the safety transfer from Auburn, a 3-star transfer, Jay Brown, the corner out of Ohio State, CJ Daniels, the guy that we talked so much about throughout spring practice and the spring game, 4-star wide receiver transfer from Liberty. I expect to see a decent bit from him as well. Gio Paez, which we did a breakdown on the defensive line a couple of weeks ago here on the podcast, which of course you can find on your preferred podcast platform and on YouTube. Gio Paez is stepping into this defensive line room with the most experience of any other player in that room. I mean, that's great for Gio Paez, not great for this defensive line room, but you at least have experience there. So, of course, Gio Paez, the defensive line transfer out of Wisconsin, and then most recently, more spring transfer portal players, JVR Suggs, defensive tackle out of Grand Valley State, the 3-star transfer, and most recently, Blake Oxendorf. Is that a who's who of transfer portal players? No, it is not. Are those household names across college football? No. No, they are not. Could they be? Sure. Why not? Absolutely. We've seen what some transfer portal players have been able to achieve and accomplish at LSU. Need I remind you of certain players named Jayden Daniels and Joe Burrow who transferred into LSU? Yeah. I know, different position, but you get the point. Not necessarily a college football Walk of Fame group. But I can live with that, at least for now. I reserve the right, and you reserve the right to change our minds about the path that Brian Kelly is taking in terms of roster construction. Because for me right now, I see the logic. Like I hear the plan and I see the plan in motion. So I don't have a problem with it. Do I have questions? Sure, absolutely. You wouldn't be a good fan if you didn't have questions about how this team is being built, about Brian Kelly's approach. But I also remember last season, drinking the Kool-Aid and taking the cheese on this transfer portal class. Oh, was it LSU was a top 5 transfer portal class. They landed Denver Harris, who was a 4-star transfer. J.K. Johnson, another 4-star transfer from Ohio State who just couldn't stay healthy. Denver Harris was the 5-star. That there were all of the, I was, I think, starstruck by the literal stars next to their names of, wow, look at all these players that LSU landed in the transfer portal. LSU is a top 5 transfer portal ranking. What'd you get from Denver Harris? A big fat goose egg. If anything, he was more of a problem than he was a solution. Like I mentioned, and of course, it's no fault of J.K. Johnson's, but your best ability is your availability, and he was not able to be incredibly available. So all of these 4-stars, Denver Harris, the 5-star that LSU landed this past season, or this past transfer portal, rather, they didn't do much for you. So I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid on that's the way to build a roster. I'm not going to get too high or too low on a transfer portal class. Because last year, the transfer portal class, yeah, there were players that were impactful. Zy Alexander, Jordan Jefferson stepping in when Mekhi Wingo got injured. Aaron Anderson is one that I'm encouraged about him taking that next step forward. But overall, it's not like the transfer portal class was the difference. So I see what Lane Kiffin is doing at Ole Miss. I see it, and I'm not hating on it. Again, because I don't know. I don't know if that's the way. I don't know if Brian Kelly's way is the way. I don't know if the way is maybe somewhere a little bit in the middle. Because another thing that I don't want to get misconstrued is that Brian Kelly is daboing himself into a corner of we don't accept transfer portal players. That's never what he said, and that's never been his thought process, at least publicly. Brian Kelly's not afraid to take transfers. Brian Kelly's also not afraid to say no if he doesn't think that it's a fit. But looking at Lane Kiffin's transfer portal class, just to kind of contrast Ole Miss, Logan Diggs was 4-star transfer, name that we know very well. Juice Wells, 4-star transfer, wide receiver out of South Carolina. Walter Nolan, a 5-star defensive lineman out of Texas A&M. Princely Imamielen, the edge rusher out of Florida, and the list goes on and on and on. Lane Kiffin signed 22 players in the transfer portal. You signed 9, one of which is a punter. Punters matter too. I understand. But I don't know what the right approach is. So you might be one that's looking at it on May 29th when you're just starving for college football content and being obsessed with the transfer portal. And look, I get it. We've all done it. We've all gotten caught up in it. I will still get caught up in it. But we don't know if that's the right approach. We are still living in an era of infancy with all of these changes in college football, transfer portal and NIL included. I don't think that we have enough of a sample size to be able to come up with a well-informed and well-researched opinion of what is the quote-unquote right way. So if you're someone looking at Brian Kelly and maybe the idleness in the transfer portal, I still landed 9 players. I mean, could you have done more? For sure. Could you have landed those high-end defensive tackles? Absolutely. But again, we understand the process, or we at least know the process. Whether we understand it or not, we'll see that on the field. Whether we start to get, peeks behind the curtain of what really is the right way to build a roster, time's going to tell. I think Ole Miss can be a college football playoff team. I also think LSU can be too. A lot of things are going to have to go right. A lot of things are going to have to go right for Ole Miss. A lot of things are going to have to go right for any team that gets into the college football playoff. 4 teams, 12 teams, 14 teams, 67 billion teams, doesn't matter. You're going to have to do right things. You're going to have to get a little bit lucky. You're going to have to avoid injury, whatever it might be. But before I, have an absolute freak out about LSU's transfer portal roundup versus maybe some other teams in this conference, maybe some other teams across college football, I'm just going to let the football do the talking for me. That's not a fun answer to have on May 29th because we're not going to know for another 3 months. But that's genuinely how I feel. That's going to do it for me today. Thank you for making Locked On LSU your first listen every single day. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up in tomorrow's edition of Locked On LSU, we'll get into a ton of baseball talk, a little bit of a recap from the SEC tournament, looking ahead to the Chapel Hill Regional. Questions. Get those mailbag questions in. We'll do 2 this week since we've got some catching up to do. Also want to take a little bit of a look around what the topic of conversation in Destin has been for the SEC spring meetings, what affects LSU directly, what affects the SEC, what's kind of a trickle-down effect of some of the massive conversations that are being had at the college football level, at the Washington, D.C. level with the House versus NCAA settlements. We will get into all of that as we progress throughout the week here on Locked On LSU.